put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The man who sold paradise and stole $7 billion. In the shadows of the Caribbean, where turquoise waters meet offshore secrecy, one man built an empire on a foundation of lies, so elaborate, so meticulously crafted, that even regulators couldn't see through it. His name was Allen Stanford, a Texas-born billionaire who owned banks, cricket stadiums, private islands, and the loyalty of thousands. But behind the yacht parties and knighthoods, behind the golden facade of respectability, Stanford was running one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, a $7 billion financial mystery that would destroy lives, collapse governments, and expose the terrifying ease with which wealth can become a weapon. This is the dark business story of a man who didn't just steal money. He sold a dream, then buried it in a vault that never existed. Allen Stanford didn't start as a criminal mastermind. He started as a hungry entrepreneur in Waco, Texas, someone who understood that in America, perception is everything. In the 1980s, he opened a series of health clubs and gyms, building a modest fortune through legitimate business. But modest wasn't enough. Stanford had tasted success, and like so many before him, he wanted more. Not just money, but the kind of power that comes with untouchable wealth. He began studying the offshore banking world, that shadowy realm where billionaire secrets are kept and financial mysteries are manufactured. What he discovered would change everything. The Caribbean was a paradise, but it was also something else. A regulatory black hole. Tiny island nations desperate for foreign investment, willing to grant banking licenses with minimal oversight. Stanford saw the opening. In 1985, he moved to Montserrat and purchased Guardian International Bank, a small offshore institution that would become the foundation of his empire. But Montserrat was just the beginning, just the first move in a corporate scandal that would span decades. When a hurricane devastated the island in 1989, Stanford relocated to Antigua, where he would find not just a new home, but a government willing to look the other way. In Antigua, Stanford didn't just open a bank, he created a myth. Stanford International Bank promised something irresistible: consistently high returns, absolute safety, and the prestige of Caribbean banking. While American banks offered 3 to 4% interest rates, Stanford promised 10 to 12%. Year after year, without fail. It seemed too good to be true, because it was. But Stanford had learned the most important lesson in wealth and power. People don't invest in numbers, they invest in stories. And Stanford was a master storyteller. He built a business empire designed to dazzle. A sprawling office complex in Antigua that looked like a palace, a private island, a fleet of jets. He bought cricket teams and stadiums, becoming a patron saint of Caribbean sports. He threw legendary parties attended by politicians, celebrities, and business elites. He donated millions to charitable causes, earning him a knighthood from the Antiguan government. Sir Allen Stanford, the benevolent billionaire. Every dollar spent was an investment in credibility. Every public appearance a calculated performance in this dark business thriller playing out in real time. But behind the glamour, the real operation was terrifyingly simple. Stanford International Bank didn't invest client money in legitimate securities or diversified portfolios. Instead, it operated like every Ponzi scheme in history, using new investors' money to pay returns to existing investors. The difference was scale and sophistication. Stanford employed an army of financial advisors across Latin America and the United States, all selling the same dream: safety, stability, and superior returns. These weren't street corner hustlers. They were licensed professionals, operating out of gleaming offices, lending institutional credibility to a business crime being committed in plain sight. The certificates of deposit Stanford sold came with glossy brochures showing diverse investment portfolios: stocks, bonds, precious metals, real estate. Investment advisors assured clients their money was managed by expert portfolio managers using sophisticated strategies. They showed audited financial statements, regulatory approvals from Antigua, and the personal guarantee of a billionaire who owned islands. What they didn't show was the truth. There was no diversified portfolio. There were no expert managers. There was just Alan Stanford, a vault that was mostly empty, and a river of money flowing in one direction, toward his personal empire. By the mid-2000s, Stanford had attracted over 30,000 investors from 113 countries. Billions of dollars poured into his bank, much of it from working-class Latin Americans who trusted him with their life savings, retirees who believed they'd found financial security, small business owners who thought they were building wealth for their families. They had no idea they were funding a billionaire's fantasy: the private jets, the mansions, the cricket tournaments, the insatiable appetite for more that defines every financial mystery built on lies. But here's where the story turns truly dark, where the business documentary becomes a horror story. Stanford didn't just lie about returns. He lied about everything. He claimed client funds were held in secure, liquid investments that could be accessed at any time. He told regulators the bank maintained a conservative portfolio with minimal risk. The reality was catastrophic. Of the $7 billion deposited by investors, Stanford had diverted billions into speculative real estate ventures, failed business acquisitions, and personal loans to himself that would never be repaid. He bought a Caribbean airline that hemorrhaged money. He constructed resort developments that sat empty. He purchased an entire Antiguan newspaper to control his public image. Every investment was a gamble, every gamble a failure, every failure hidden by the next wave of deposits from new victims. The liquidity crisis was inevitable, yet Stanford operated as if it would never come. This is the psychology of the Ponzi architect: a belief in their own invincibility, a conviction that the scheme can continue forever if you just think big enough, move fast enough, lie convincingly enough. Stanford genuinely believed he could invest his way out of the hole he'd dug. He thought that if he could just land one massive deal, build one successful resort, launch one profitable airline, he could make the numbers real. It's the gambler's fallacy at a billion-dollar scale, the dangerous belief that the next bet will fix everything. Meanwhile, warning signs were everywhere for those willing to see them. Venezuelan regulators questioned Stanford's returns as early as the 1990s. Financial analysts published reports calling the bank's performance impossible. The SEC received multiple complaints about Stanford's operations. But offshore banking is designed to be opaque, and Stanford had spent years building political protection. He hired former government officials as advisors. He made strategic donations to politicians on both sides of the aisle. He cultivated relationships with Antiguan authorities who depended on his economic contributions to their small nation. When regulators came knocking, Stanford had lawyers, lobbyists, and political allies ready to push back. The SEC did investigate Stanford International Bank in the late 1990s and again in 2005, but each time the inquiry stalled. Offshore jurisdiction complicated enforcement. Stanford's legal team was formidable, and crucially, examining the bank would require Antiguan cooperation that never came. This is how financial crimes thrive in the modern world. Not through complete invisibility, but through jurisdictional complexity, regulatory capture, and the willingness of small nations to trade oversight for investment. Stanford had built his empire in the cracks of the global financial system, and for years, those cracks protected him. By 2008, the cracks were becoming chasms. The global financial crisis that year devastated markets worldwide, and Ponzi schemes everywhere began collapsing as nervous investors demanded their money back. Bernie Madoff's $65 billion fraud was exposed in December 2008, sending shockwaves through the financial world and putting every high-return investment under scrutiny. Stanford's impossible returns suddenly looked very familiar, very suspicious. Redemption requests at Stanford International Bank accelerated. The liquidity that had never really existed was suddenly, urgently needed. Stanford did what every Ponzi operator does when the walls close in. He doubled down. He launched aggressive marketing campaigns in Latin America, promising even higher returns to attract fresh capital. He pressured his financial advisors to sell harder, recruit faster, bring in more deposits to feed the machine. He moved money between accounts, created fake transactions, manufactured the appearance of liquidity where none existed. It was financial sleight of hand performed at industrial scale, a business thriller playing out in accounting ledgers and wire transfers. But the SEC was finally paying attention. In January 2009, just weeks after Madoff's arrest, investigators began a serious examination of Stanford's empire. What they found was stunning in its simplicity and scale. Of the $7 billion Stanford claimed to hold in safe liquid investments, only $1 billion could be accounted for. The rest had vanished into a maze of personal loans, failed ventures, and outright fraud. The conservative portfolio was a fiction. The expert managers didn't exist. The entire operation was a corporate scandal built on paperwork and promises. On February 17, 2009, the SEC filed civil fraud charges against Alan Stanford and his companies. The empire built over 2 decades collapsed in hours. But Stanford wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. As federal agents closed in, he fled. He chartered a private jet and disappeared, triggering an international manhunt for a billionaire who had nowhere left to hide. For 4 days, the world watched as this dark business story entered its final, desperate chapter. What happened next reveals something crucial about the psychology of the fraudster: the inability to accept that the game is over. Stanford believed he could still salvage something, still negotiate a way out, still use his money and connections to avoid consequences. He made frantic calls to lawyers, politicians, anyone who might help him escape justice. He tried to access hidden accounts, move remaining assets beyond the reach of prosecutors. But the infrastructure he'd built to hide his wealth, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the layered corporate structures, now trapped him. Every asset was frozen, every account monitored, every escape route closed. Federal marshals found Alan Stanford in Virginia on June 18, 2009. He was arrested, charged with 21 criminal counts, including conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. The man who once threw million-dollar parties and owned Caribbean islands was now inmate number 35,017-183. But even then, the legal battle was far from over. Stanford's trial, delayed repeatedly by his claims of amnesia and addiction to anti-anxiety medication, finally began in January 2012. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: falsified financial statements, fraudulent accounting records, testimony from former employees who described the systematic lies told to investors. They showed how Stanford personally approved bogus investment reports, how he directed staff to create fake portfolio holdings, how he used investor money to fund a lifestyle of staggering excess while telling clients their savings were safe. Stanford's defense strategy was revealing in its desperation. He claimed he was a legitimate businessman who made bad investments, not a criminal who ran a Ponzi scheme. He insisted he always intended to pay investors back, that he was just waiting for his real estate ventures to mature. He portrayed himself as a victim of dishonest employees, of market crashes, of regulatory persecution. It was the same pattern seen in every business crime documentary: the refusal to accept responsibility, the reframing of deliberate fraud as unfortunate circumstance. The jury didn't buy it. After 5 days of deliberation, they convicted Alan Stanford on 13 of 14 counts. On June 14, 2012, he was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. The judge called his crimes egregious and noted that Stanford had shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the devastation he'd caused. At 62 years old, Stanford would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a spectacular fall from the heights of wealth and power. But the human cost of Stanford's fraud extends far beyond his prison cell. More than 30,000 investors from 113 countries lost everything. Retirees who deposited their pensions saw their life savings evaporate overnight. Families who trusted Stanford with college funds for their children were left with worthless certificates. Small business owners in Latin America who believed in the billionaire's promise of security faced financial ruin. Some victims lost their homes. Some lost their health. Some took their own lives, unable to cope with the magnitude of betrayal. The recovery process has been brutal and incomplete. A court-appointed receiver has worked for over a decade to trace and recover Stanford's assets. But the math is unforgiving. Of the $7 billion stolen, only about $1 billion has been recovered and distributed to victims. Most investors have received pennies on the dollar, if they've received anything at all. The offshore structure. Stanford used to build his empire, has made asset recovery a nightmare of jurisdictional battles and hidden accounts. The Stanford case also exposed catastrophic regulatory failures that enabled this business scandal documentary to unfold across 2 decades. The SEC had multiple opportunities to stop Stanford, but failed repeatedly due to resource constraints, jurisdictional confusion, and institutional inertia. Antiguan regulators, dependent on Stanford's economic contributions, provided minimal oversight and maximum cooperation with his operations. International coordination between financial regulators proved inadequate against a sophisticated offshore operation. These systemic weaknesses persist today, creating space for the next Alan Stanford to emerge. What made Stanford's fraud particularly insidious was its veneer of legitimacy. Unlike street corner scams or obvious pyramid schemes, Stanford International Bank looked and felt real. It had regulatory approval from a sovereign nation. It employed licensed financial advisors. It produced professional financial statements audited by accounting firms. Its owner was knighted, celebrated, trusted by governments and communities. This teaches us something dark about money and greed. The bigger the lie, the more elaborate the performance, the easier it is to believe. Stanford's psychology offers a window into how ordinary ambition curdles into criminal enterprise. He started as a legitimate entrepreneur who wanted success. But at some point, the desire for wealth became a need for dominance, for validation, for the intoxicating power that comes from controlling billions. The scheme likely began small, maybe inflating returns slightly, maybe borrowing from client accounts temporarily with plans to repay. But each small fraud made the next one easier. Each success required a larger lie to maintain, until the entire structure depended on continuous deception. This is the trajectory of financial mystery and fraud. A gradual moral collapse disguised as business strategy. Today, Alan Stanford sits in a Florida federal prison, serving a sentence that will end long after his death. His empire of lies has been dismantled, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed. But his victims remain, still waiting for justice that may never fully come, still trying to rebuild lives shattered by a billionaire's greed. The case stands as a monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition, regulatory failure, and the terrible ease with which trust can be weaponized for profit. The lessons are uncomfortable but essential. High returns that seem too good to be true almost always are. Complexity in investment structures often serves to hide rather than enhance value. Offshore operations promising secrecy and superior performance deserve extreme skepticism. Charismatic founders and impressive credentials are not substitutes for transparency and verifiable results. And perhaps most importantly, the mechanisms that enable entrepreneurship and wealth creation, offshore banking, light touch regulation, trust-based financial systems, can just as easily enable massive fraud when integrity fails. Alan Stanford's story is a dark business thriller, but it's not fiction. It's a warning. A warning about the seductive power of wealth, the fragility of financial systems, and the human cost when ambition loses all ethical constraint. Somewhere right now, another charismatic entrepreneur is building another empire on promises rather than performance, hiding lies behind professional presentations and impressive offices. The question is whether we've learned enough from Stanford's catastrophic fraud to recognize the pattern before billions more disappear and thousands more lives are destroyed. Because in the shadowy world where wealth and power intersect with deception, where offshore secrecy meets desperate greed, the next Alan Stanford is already out there, selling a dream, building a myth, and counting on our willingness to believe that this time, impossibly high returns are real. The vault might look different, the promise might sound new, but the fundamental lie remains the same, that you can build something from nothing, that the money is safe, that the dream is real. And somewhere in the Caribbean, where turquoise waters still meet offshore secrecy, the machinery of deception continues to turn. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.